right, should I start, Justin? Or... Everyone's leaving. All right, so I think I'll get started. Everyone excited to stay? Yeah. So it's interesting. I really wanted to come up with a topic that would empower everybody. So I know there's folks, you know, that are here attending that might be C-level, but there's also folks like me that like to turn the knobs every once in a while and tweak things. So I try to include a little bit of everything. And the focus of this is really passive and active defense, but understanding what we've done from a passive perspective, and I think everybody in the industry has done a lot of that. What we haven't, I don't think, done a good job about is around active defense. So I'm Jason Maynard. I'm a cybersecurity expert at Cisco, and I'm currently based out of Alberta. So, and don't take offense to the hoodie. I've done sessions before for BCAware, for example, or not BCAware, but other events where someone came to me at the end of the event and said, "What's with the hoodie? Like, why the hoodie? I think it's you know, they're stereotyping." I said, "I love the hoodie. I'd wear a hoodie all day long, right? What's wrong with the hoodie? Why is that a bad thing?" So we're going to talk a little bit about operational and informational technologies. Very high level. We'll talk about hard exterior and soft interior. We'll talk about passive and active defense, and then we'll really focus on the active side. Some of the things that you can take away from today and maybe apply it to your own security practice. All right, so operational environment. I think anybody that has these have been, you know, had the luxury of having it kind of off in an island, right? It's got nice heavy waters around it, nobody's able to get into it. But the business has been driving or wanting analytics out of the operational environment, right? And so there's no longer these islands, there's these bridges. And in those bridges, what they have is some controls, right? Some very basic controls going into the business network, or what we call the IT environment. And you know, those controls exist. But the problem with the operational environment is that the protocols that are used within this environment haven't really been meant to be secure, right? Because they have been islands. They were defended by just being isolated. So we have certain controls between OT and IT, and the differences between the two, some might argue, IT is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And OT, again, some might argue, right? It's availability, integrity, and confidentiality. Availability is key because people may die, right? The action you might take in OT might be something like alert. In IT, you know, you're cutting people's heads off, right? Because you're okay with that result. But you can't necessarily do that in OT. The challenge we have is we really don't know what normal looks like in the operational environment, nor have we done a really good job of knowing what normal looks like in the IT environment. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So we want better visibility, but we also want to ensure that we're adding some advanced capabilities, right? Algorithms that can understand known good, known bad, and then learn from those samples to find the unknowns, right? Or what people will call machine learning or algorithm, or artificial intelligence, right? But they're all algorithms at the base. So we want to make sure that we're extending that capability beyond IT networks, right? And I know there's some folks that have operational environments, and then some may not, right? So hard exterior, soft interior. So we've done a kind of a good job of making sure that, you know, that crust is there, that perimeter that kind of used to exist, a little porous now, right? Or a lot, right? The perimeter really doesn't exist the way we used to know the perimeter as. But we got things like DNS and email, firewalls, IPSs, right? We've done a good job there. Whether you're OT, operational environment, whether you're IT or have a combination of both, you probably have all these capabilities. But when we start getting inside the IT environment, or we start getting inside the OT environment, which in many cases is much worse, is that we've got some problems, right? You've got things like supply chain. The adversary knows that we're doing a better job defending. So what about going to the manufacturer's website and loading firmware that you're going to do a checksum against and download and deploy on your systems, right? So from supply chain, the inception of development, all the way down to when you deploy that on your hardware, you want to make sure you have trustworthy systems, right? You want to know from start to finish that you can trust the entire chain. So you want to be looking at the manufacturers that you're dealing with to ensure that that exists. Things like vulnerabilities or localized malware or USB contamination, right? Now what's interesting in USB contamination was a couple years ago at a security event, they went around with a USB key, okay? They put a little bit of benign information on there to execute when you plugged it in, right? So it got the geo, the IP address, a little bit of information. And they had 100 of these keys. Again, this is a security conference, and they started walking around and sharing them with people, right? And you know, at a security event, you have a bag with all that junk, kind of like what you guys have today, right? That you're gonna pick up. They would walk in behind you and drop that USB key off into your bag. So you didn't even know that you picked it up, it just ends up being there. And what they found, some interesting things is if you leave the USB key alone and put it in the bathroom on the counter, nobody would touch it. But put a little piece of paper under it and all of a sudden it was attractive. Not sure why, but people would pick it up. So there was 100 of these distributed. How many do you think actually connected? Remember, this is a security conference. So I would say 50 would be fairly successful. Because we're talking about people that generally know, right? About the consequences of plugging in that USB key. Even 25, I'd say, would be impressive. It was over 100 that connected back. Why over 100? What do people do with USB keys? They share them, right? So it was over 100. Now, I know this group here, or some of you, I know you're all saying, I would never do that, right? I will never take a USB key that I pick up today and never plug it into my computer, right? Well, I'll tell you, one thing that I have realized, even with security experts, when it comes to USB keys, size matters. So the bigger the USB key, 1 terabyte, is a security expert going to walk away from that? No, they're going to roll up their sleeves and say, I got this. This is a big drive, right? And game over. So that inside or that soft interior is certainly a problem. You got things like, you know, who's talking to who. You've got unsanctioned or sanctioned devices. If I was to compromise an operational environment, where would I leave a USB key? Maybe at a field locations gate, right? Nice big juicy USB key sitting there. A field technician walks in and goes, whoa, look at that. It's my lucky day. And then they're going to go in and plug into that port that's probably wide open. And if there's any connectivity anywhere else, they're going to be able to move laterally, and that USB key is going to, you know, invoke its own will on the individual or systems. Misconfiguration, right? So communication outside. How do you know the controls you put in place are always working all the time? Did someone make a mistake? How can you prove that, right? So with passive defense, you focus on deploying and maintaining and reducing overall impact, right? That's kind of the goal of passive defense. And we've done a pretty good job of that to some degree, right? I mean, it's complicated. There's lots of products out there. Everybody claims that they can do everything. But active defense is going to take it a step further, right? So you're going to monitor the environment for which you're responsible, and you're going to be able to be a little more agile because you have a better understanding. You're going to be able to respond to incidences or an incident with precision, right? Because again, you know what's happening both east, west, north, south. And then you're going to change the environment, right? So the ultimate goal is to obviously minimize the overall impact or reduce the adversary's capability, right? And then you have things like lessons learned, right? So that's kind of active defense. We're going to talk a lot about that today. Passive defense, those are some of the things. We just talked about it, right? DNS, email security, web content, web application firewalls, yada, 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 right? And then we got the next generation label, right? We use it, you know, competitors use it. Everybody uses next generation. How many people like the term next generation? Because I hate it. Why? Because it doesn't expire, ever. Never expires. 8 years ago, I come out with a firewall, next generation. I can do nothing with it, still next generation. Imagine a loaf of bread that said expiry date, next generation. I mean, it's bad, right? So it's up to you guys to figure out, is it next generation or next generation, right? It's complicated. But you've got things like endpoint security, you've got firewalls and IPSs, and everybody's going to say they have a next generation of something. Active defense, there's 4 kind of tenets in it, right? You've got threat intelligence, or the consumption of that. And this is why I'm saying there's a little bit for everybody here. Asset ID and network security monitoring can't protect what you don't know, right? And it goes beyond a Windows endpoint, right? You can't put an endpoint agent everywhere, right? If you've got CT scanners, are you putting an agent on that? Probably not, you void warranty. SCADA device, same thing, right? Incident response, right? That's going to be a tenet. And then you got threat and environment manipulation, right? Anybody know Locard's exchange principle? So this individual, I guess, is the Sherlock Holmes of France, right? Back in the day. And basically a pioneer of forensic science. So basically what he states is that whether you're a criminal or an adversary trying to break in, I guess, fall in line with being a criminal, you can't enter a crime scene and leave a scene without either leaving something behind, right? Some type of trace, whether it's, hair, obviously not my case, but it could be hair, right? A computer might trigger a firewall rule, or they might traverse the network in a different manner, but there's logs or data that's left behind. If they're able to not leave any trace, they might take something from the scene that ties them back to the scene, right? And so with systems, it's very much the same thing, right? There is a lot more information available to you in regards to what might take place if you were breached. You just got to know where to find it, right? Or where to look. Anybody remember NotPetya? Anybody? We're going to talk about NotPetya 2 that doesn't exist, right? But I'm going to say what happens if it's NotPetya 2. But this one's interesting. And I don't know that the industry's done a really good job about talking about it. This is a great article, too, if you guys want to really peel back the weeds in regards to NotPetya. But in April of 2017, an exploit was leaked, right? Allegedly created by the NSA, right? And the group that leaked that was Shadow Brokers. So that was in April of 2017. So in March of 2017, so the month before, Microsoft released a patch. So if you patched all your, how many people patch here? Anybody want to? Wow. I know where I'm, no, I'm just kidding. We got USB keys out there anyway. But so we need to do better at patching. But if you patched 100% of everything that ran Microsoft at that time, you were protected. Woohoo, right? Fantastic. We've been patching my entire career, right? And it's only getting worse because there's devices that go beyond Windows or Microsoft, right? Or traditional assets, workstations, and laptops, right? You got mobile devices, you got IoT devices. But if you patched, that was great. If you left one patch or system unpatched, you were potentially vulnerable. And now this was very clever. It was really meant to be disruptive. This wasn't about making money. This is really about causing harm, right? So if you got compromised, it took systems down, right? So what happened was, if they found one system, they got on it, and then this is the clever, really cool part, they would actually harvest credentials out of memory and then move laterally. So they just needed one. You know that system that the business said you can't patch because it's prime time? Well, that's the one they got on. And because they were able to steal credentials, they were able to move laterally within the organization. How much do you think this cost companies in regards to damage? Anybody want to shout out a number?
Billions.
How much?
Billions.
One company? $1 billion? No, one company, an individual company. 300, yeah, so somebody's got some insight into that, right? But here's some of the numbers, right? Pharmaceutical company, 870 million. I'm not saying 87 million or 8 million, which I think is a lot. 870 million. Delivery company, 400 million. French construction, 384. And you can see the numbers. And we're talking hundreds of millions. One organization, almost $1 billion. And yet we're talking about some of the ransomware attacks that happen or exist out there. Right? So if you haven't read this article, the link's there. It's a really good article on how some of these organizations were compromised and the kind of impact to them. The White House estimated it cost roughly $10 billion. Right? That's massive. All right, let's talk a little bit about threat intelligence, right? This is exciting, right? Yeah? No? Okay, it'll get better. All right, so intelligence lifecycle. So just don't consume intelligence for the sake of consuming intelligence, right? Have a purpose, right? So you want to have planning and direction, right? What are the requirements? Maybe you want to know what the CNC is, right? The whole idea around cyber intelligence is really truly understand the tactics, techniques, and procedures your adversaries are going to use against you so you can ultimately defend yourself. You have collection. Where do you want to place this device to capture information? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. You got processing and exploitation, so taking that binary data and turning it into ASCII, something meaningful for humans, right? You'll do analysis and production. So this is really key in where some of the artificial intelligence or machine learning is not necessarily always going to provide the answers you need, right? You need a human involved, at least today, right? So the analyst will come in and analyze that data, and hopefully it aligns with the planning and direction. And then you disseminate or integrate with that information. So whether you're feeding that into technologies or passive defenses, right, to start mitigating risk, or you're sharing that with the greater community, right, to help everybody be able to protect themselves, you're going to do that in this kind of phase, right? And then you have evaluation and feedback. That's kind of that closed loop that you continue to feed in and make sure that the outcomes actually translate back to that whole planning and direction side. Why am I doing it in the first place? So you want to build this out. Open source information. Now this one I love because I find it very interesting, right? So we all want to pound our chest to tell everyone how awesome we are, right? Public sector does a good job about that because they're taxpayers' money, so they want to tell you everything they're going to do, right? Well, as an adversary, I can sit back and learn a whole lot, right? So you got things like company information. Just go to your website. I can get publicly branded documents from there. I don't even have to create them. I can just go download them, right? Then maybe register a nice looking domain that feels and smells just like your domain, and then start sending out that document. And it could be as simple as just phishing, or maybe I embed malware in that document, right, to get somebody to trigger. So I can do that without actually knocking on your door, right? Public announcements. So you're going to host the Olympics. What do? You tell everybody what you're going to do, right? All the way down to sometimes the complete topology is there. All the versions, the products that are going to be deployed, everything's public knowledge. Job descriptions, right? That's the good one. Go up and find out not only do you have these technologies that are in place, but also that you're shorthanded. That's perfect, right? You're shorthanded, and I know everything that you're using from a security perspective. Advisories and alerts, internet-connected devices, right? I can scan your environment without actually scanning your environment, right? Somebody else has already done it. I just have to go and get the information. You got exploit databases, user forums, etc., right? So I did an example, and I thought I better not say a city because I could get in trouble. So City of Security, which hopefully doesn't exist, is building a facility. It's connected to the greater network of the City of Security. They are a public entity, so they announce the partners that they're working with, right? The products. So now I can go look at the partners, who's the partners involved, learn a little bit about them, maybe act as them. Currently looking for certain skill sets, right? Product research will tell me about the advisories and alerts, and ultimately then I can look for vulnerabilities and exploits against those systems. If I have the IP address, I might already see devices that are connected to the internet that maybe shouldn't be. And I've done that without ever triggering any technology that you have today, right? I've done nothing. There's no knock on the door, but I'm coming in well educated, right, or prepared. External threat intelligence, right? You're going to continue to consume that, right? You still have to relate it to your environment to some degree, but there's all kinds of them, right? It could be the ISACs, it could be the Canadian Cyber Exchange, the Department of Homeland Security, SAN Internet Storm Center, etc., right? Lots out there. And I put an example of some of the stuff that you might get from a external threat intelligence feed, right? You get things like IP addresses and domains and all of that, right? And a lot of times what you're going to do is you're hoping your products are updating with this new information. But you may not be taking that little piece of information and actually really understanding what that means and maybe what other elements might be part of that campaign. Remember, this research is done based on what they've done. There might be more information out there, but I think we stop as security practitioners. We don't continue to move forward. We just say, oh, these are the indications of compromises. I've got them now mitigated, right? Hopefully there's no impact, and you move on. Internal threat intelligence, you got things like endpoint event, traffic analysis, DNS analysis, right? User behavior, and these are just some examples, right? Honeypots. And then as you move along, you might even be doing things like reverse engineering of malware. But you'll have some internal data sources that you're going to consume as well, right? And you'll have folks that are responsible for that. Now, it comes with intelligence sharing. I won't ask the question who's doing intelligence sharing, but are you classifying the data that you are sharing? So traffic light protocol is a good example of how you can do that. TLP red, right? Probably very intimate. You're only sharing it with people internal to your organization, right? Very restrictive. There could be classified information in there. And then you've got things like TLP white, which is a little more community-based. You're sharing it with everyone, right? But it might still have copyright protection in it or stuff like that. But you want to classify that, right? So I've talked to many customers, and this isn't a vendor thing, right? This is just really looking at things that you can do to classify that data and maybe step up a little bit. Sticks and taxi are two mechanisms that allow you to transport and send it in the right format to other systems. So when you get that indications of compromise or the tactics, techniques, and procedures, once you understand that, then you may want to feed some of those mechanisms into your passive defenses, and this is a way of doing that. So that's intelligence sharing. Asset ID and network security monitoring. That's kind of what I think, right? No laughs? You guys are tired. I laughed at this every time I put it up, right? But we're running blind. And the reason why we're running blind, I know everybody in this room's got a firewall with next-gen capabilities. You've got some endpoint capabilities. You've got hopefully some email security. And you've got all these point product probably in your environment that are doing certain things that are defending. That's good, right? You need those things. But do you truly understand what's in your data center? Now, the smaller the organization, they'll shoot me off an IP and tell me what version of Windows are on it. Maybe even what version of applications on it, right? The bigger the organization, this gets a lot harder. You're a government entity, this is almost impossible, right? And the data center is something that's probably a little, or hopefully a little more controlled, right? Because those are your crown jewels. What about the campus network, right? You got things like BYOD. You got people bringing in their devices and logging in because all you have is simple username and password to connect, right? If you even have that. You've got smart devices, right? This one I think is interesting, especially in education, right? Is I go into a school board and all you see is a bunch of smart TVs plugged in, wired in, right? Maybe sometimes they're segmented on a layer 2 network of some sort and have to go through hopefully some L3 boundary somewhere. But these are being plugged in. Imagine having a field location with a coffee room that has a network jack. And somebody sees there's two plugs. One's for the smart fridge, maybe, that was supposed to be there. And then there's another jack there that they bring in their TV because during lunch break they want to watch Netflix. Maybe they'll get out, maybe they won't. Hopefully they don't. But they're adding these assets to your environment and you have no idea that they exist. They all run an operating system of some sort. You're not going to put an agent on these, You're going to have to look for other opportunities to be able to determine that these exist or control whether or not they can connect. And then you got things like CT scanners. You got SCADA environment or operational environment. And a lot of these devices, you're not going to be able to put anything on it because the vendor will void warranty. So you got to go beyond an endpoint. You've got to look at maybe the network or DNS or other things to be able to understand what's happening with that asset. So network security monitoring, what you're going to do is start, right, if you're not starting. And I'm not talking about a firewall, because you got a firewall, you're doing network security monitoring. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that you've got to go beyond that. So you're going to collect information, right? So you're going to look for choke points in your environment. Now, common ones would be campus to internet, campus to data center. Hopefully you've got a control point there. So those are obvious ones. And then you got things like hotspots. Maybe you've got sensitive environment with critical data on it. So maybe you want additional probes or plugs into that environment so you can see what's happening, right? And then you need to detect. So you're going to use all kinds of mechanisms to detect, right? Firewalls, IPSs, next-gen something, right? You're going to use that to help you, right? You want to get rid of a lot of the noise. And then you're going to have analysis. Some of that will be technology-driven. Some of that will be human-driven. And then you'll have, incident response for things that materialize. And then you'll have things like false positives that will go back through that closed loop and you start over, right? And hopefully you're not drowned by the number of false positives, right? That's something that you certainly want to minimize. So collection, you got span, mirror ports, right? You've got things like TCP dump, IP fix, firewall logs, Windows event logs, etc. Right? You get the idea. And you might aggregate that data to a SIM. And again, I try to be very agnostic, not talk about product, right? But there is some certain technologies that are open and available that you can leverage, that the adversary can embed malware or code into. Never mind. But anyways, intrusion detection, ZigBee, right? If you have an operational environment, most likely they're not talking traditional wireless that you think of, right? So you may want to get additional tools. You got host intrusion detection systems, flow data, network baselines. What I find is there's a couple areas that people don't focus on, and that's flow, right? Because it's available. It's a transaction of everything that you do, and you can store it long term. And the other one is DNS, and those are two areas we're going to focus on. People don't look at DNS, right? There's a large number of requests that are made much, much earlier on before an HTTP connection, and that's DNS. The adversary uses DNS because they want to move around. If they use an IP, security companies are batting them out of the air, right? They're blocking them, and then they have to go, and it's much more complicated. If they use a domain name, they can flip that out very quickly, right? So we don't do a very good job of centralizing our DNS data, and nor do we do a good job, in my opinion, looking at the network itself and how it behaves. So you can see some of the analysis stuff, right? File analysis, timeline analysis, right? DNS analysis, packet analysis, etc. Where's the bad in that? Anybody? Can see it? I made it red, and I made it up. It's not actually bad. I don't know. It might be. But it's very hard, right? It's very hard to determine what bad is, because bad might be something that's known. That's the easy stuff. That's what all the security vendors are helping you with, right? There's some MI, right, or machine learning and AI, right? That exists. I get it. But it's very hard if you don't have additional insight. So if you don't know what normal looks like within your network, then how do you know when abnormal happens? Right? You don't. And I'm going to show you an example. So there's things that you could pick out from this flow data, right? You pick out data hoarding, exfiltration, command and control. You can actually look at ways of locking in certain systems that if they do talk beyond those systems themselves, you want to alert. You can actually prove whether or not your firewall rules are actually working 365 days, 7/24 all the time, right? Not a mistake, fat finger, and then changed it back, right? Not have to worry about audit time, showing a bunch of rules or complicated rules, what you have in place. You can actually prove that there was never communication outside that boundary. So DDoS attempt, bad geo, etc. So we're going to go through an example, right? So this is a little bit getting into the weeds, making sure that we make everybody happy. And with Flow, right, I can see communications between host A and Active Directory, for example, a print server, an email server, and the web, right? And if I can baseline that, I get a good idea of what it normally looks like. So I can trigger on things that are abnormal. They might be a real security event, or it might be a new service. I had a perfect example of this where an organization, fairly large, had a major incident, right? So they had some outages, and nobody could get out to the internet. And they had no idea what it was. Well, somebody went ahead and decommissioned their WSS, their patching system. And I guess by default or the way it was built, everybody on Patch Tuesday went to the internet. And we're talking tens of thousands of devices, right? So it's fully saturated, but it took them for a very, very long time to determine what was actually going on. With flow data, you'd be able to see that very quickly, right? Sure, you can have grass, but that just tells you that there's a bump, right? It doesn't tell you what's causing the bump. So I'm going to use Russia as an example. I apologize, right? I could pick any other country, but I think Russia, they got some good capabilities, so I thought I'd use their flag. So there's only a small change, right? So going to a Russian site doesn't mean anything, right? It's noise. But what if the volume, and that's what the thickness of the line is, right? That could trigger an alert. Again, this is an unknown threat. You don't know it exists yet. The security companies haven't flagged this as a bad IP or domain. Nobody knows. But you see that, right? Then what happens is you see from host A to B, host A to C, and host A to D, SMB type activity. Not normal, but you see that. Now things become a little bit interesting. What would make this really interesting? What if they all went to that same IP shortly after that, right? And if you think of something like WannaCry, this was something like what happened with WannaCry, right? But again, before security technologies knew about it or being bad, this is something that could have triggered an alert. And sure, you didn't know what it was called, but you knew it shouldn't have been doing that, right? So we're going to come back to a little bit more of that. But I'll break down real quick what flow analysis can do. So it's 5-tuple, source, destination IP, source, destination port, and protocol, right? So now we know a little bit about the host A, where it's going, right? That's all good. We can flip out that IP to have the geo. So that's good. Whoops, sorry. And then as we go along, what if we can add more information? So start and end time, right? That'll help with timeline analysis. You've got user and device type. You got receive and transmit. So this might help me with volume, right? You've got round trip time and server response time. Now, anybody in here on the networking side with a leg in security, but really focus on networks? Yeah, a couple. It's always a network, right? But it's never the network, right? I started on the networking side, right? Everyone, it's not the network. It's fine. Look, I tested it. It's fine, right? And they say, prove it, because it's this black box nobody knows about, right? And you have that debate, and then finally, hopefully, some resolution happens over a period of time. Well, with round trip time and server response time, now I can tell you the round trip time is 220 milliseconds. The server took 200 milliseconds to respond, right? Back to you, app team or server team, right? Look at your system. You've got URI information, you've got application identity, you've got device processed. I love device process because to me, I want to know, was it Firefox launched by Jason that went to the Russian site, or was it PowerShell under NT Authority subsystem that made the connection to Russia, right? It changes the way you're going to approach that, right? Instantly. So that could be data exfiltration, right? Let's assume maybe that's what it was. And then the other ones might be an SMB probe. So these are two events that can get triggered. Again, this is using flow data to get that information. I'm not waiting for an endpoint to tell me something magical is happening because it's a printer. I can't even get something on the endpoint, right? So incident response kicks off. So we're going to come back to incident response. But before we do that, we are going to talk about DNS analysis. Right? How many people take those indications of compromises, whether it's from Cisco site, some other site, doesn't really matter. When you take that information in, Do you take that information for what it is and just start looking at it from that lens? Or do you take that as knowledge and then expand upon or potentially expand upon it, right? So if you start with a site, so we tell you a site or somebody else tells you a site, doesn't really matter, is bad. You want to look at maybe google-verify.com, okay? So that's good. You know that. But would it be nice to know who registered that domain? You might not get this information, but you could if it's available. And what happens if they have, out of 5 domains that they've registered, 4 have been malicious? Right? There's a trend there, right? Good information. Then you can now look at that and make a decision to expand. What are those other 4 domains? Maybe I should do a quick query to see if any of our assets actually communicated with these other domains. Maybe they've been in here a lot longer. Maybe that's part of the attack infrastructure. You've got things like domain to autonomous system number. So now we can figure out what ISP that it's coming from. That might give us an indication of, first, where it is, and second, whether or not it's prevalent in regards to how many threats might exist in that ISP, right? You've got patterns. So you can look at wave patterns of DNS requests. If you have the ability, you should be able to say what an exploit kit looks like, what a phishing campaign looks like, right? They're very similar in behavior. And again, we're talking at DNS. I'm not waiting for HTTP establish or HTTPS. I'm not worrying about decryption at this point. I'm saying at DNS later, I can provide some information that's valuable and maybe bat this down earlier, right? Co-occurrence. I love co-occurrence, right? So if you are able to consolidate all of your DNS data, you might be able to see 100% of the time that the individual that goes to google-verify.com, right, nothing to do with Google, actually 100% of the time, either shortly before or shortly after, had went to yahoo-activations.com, again, nothing to do with Yahoo. That would be interesting. That might be another new piece of information that you might want to look for, because you know what? Maybe google-verify.com is the exploit kit server. And maybe the activation one might be the CNC, right? As you continue, you want to look at domain to IP mappings, other malicious domains that might exist with those IPs. But look, I started with one piece of information, and you can see how fast I can expand upon that initial information. Right? It's how much you know. It's how much data you can consume and ingest it and make sense of it. So then incident response kicks off, and we'll come back to that. All right, incident response. So I'll just cover this at a high level, right? So you want to be prepared, right? If you have an IR retainer, that's fantastic. You have somebody on the hook. But you may want to make sure you have procedures down, backpacks ready, tools, right? Because the last thing you want to do is have an incident and find out you can't even get to the system that you've stored all this data on that you're going to use during an incident, right? So you want a backpack ready to go. You want to make sure the people that are going to be part of that process know that they're going to be part of that process, right? You do detection, right? So, and you want to be ready for certain things. Like if it's say a web server that's being scanned for vulnerabilities, you might already have defensive capabilities in play already to defend against that. But what if the adversary changes the methods in which they do that? You might want run books or playbooks, exactly how you might action against that. Do that now. It's easier to do it now than it is when you're going through an incident. I've always said this, right? Honestly, nobody cares. There's some people that care, but nobody cares how many threats you're batting out of the air, right? Nobody cares. I mean, I care. Yeah, I care because I'm geeky like that. And some of you might care because you can maybe say this is the value you're getting out of the technologies that we've implemented. But at the end of the day, the business doesn't care. What they care about is that you're keeping them safe, right? It's your job. But you'll never be remembered, ever be remembered for the thousands or hundreds of thousands of threats you block. I mean, I might remember you, but nobody else remembers you. They'll remember you for the one that gets in and how you were able to respond. So you want to get prevention capabilities, but you want to make sure that you're focusing a lot of your efforts on the after side as well. What happens when that, I got 99.9% efficacy, but it's the one that gets in, right? So things like analysis, right? You're going to perform analysis, look at things like what your logs are stating what normal looks like, and come out with obviously a better understanding of what took place. Or you've got things like containment, eradication, and recovery, right? Or scope, contain, or remediate. Doesn't matter how you say it, but the idea here now is bring systems back online, right? Truly understand the full scope of it. Not just one indicator, but the entire scope. So say, for example, today we hear about not Pecha 2. That doesn't exist, as far as I know. But and if it does exist, I didn't know. But let's say it exists today. So, and your leadership team is on the way into the office, and they're hearing it on the news radio, and they come in. The first thing, what are they going to ask you? Are we protected? And the second thing they're going to ask you is, have we been compromised? Right? So you're going to look to see if you're protected. Now think about how you might do that today. You're going to go to a website, because now you got to learn a little bit about this not Pecha. If only you had the radio off, right? It would have been better. But you're going to have to learn a little bit about what the threat is, right? You're going to go to some sites, you're going to research, you're going to look for indications. And then what do? How do you know your systems are actually actively blocking it? Well, there might be a way for you to look it up on a firewall, or go to an email device or an endpoint. This is getting complicated, right? You're walking around the infrastructure trying to figure out where you're defending against certain elements within the attack. You might just email me, right? Because it's easy, and say, Jay, are you guys blocking this? Right? And I'm like, oh, no, I got to do it, right? It's hard, but wouldn't it be nice to be able to instantly be able to put some information into a tool that gives you insight, right? Not only tells you whether or not you're defending, but whether or not you've been compromised. But you got to go beyond the information that you're finding, because you might find that there's other traces of information that are part of the same campaign, and that's where things like flow or endpoint analysis and logs, all that information can help you with, right? It's just really trying to consume and make sense of it. And then you've got post-incident, right? Make sure that it's actually working. We've stopped them, right? And then things like lessons learned. You'll have chain of command, right? So evidence and incident handlers, right? They're going to be important. These are the folks that are going out and scoping and truly doing the analysis. Lead responders are going to provide, obviously, leadership and guidance, and they're really a conduit to ensure that you can do, or if you're an evidence and incident handler, that you can effectively do your job without the BU saying, is it done yet? Is it done? Have we figured it out, right? Kind of a little bit of a barrier. And then you've got, incident response directors that are going to help broker between the business, right? And communicate with them. So again, this is a high level of roles that you might want to consider when doing this. The other one is IR communication. So how are you going to communicate the data and where, right? So you want a good understanding of that. You might need to reach out to your ISP, right? It might be something within the ISP that's where it all started, right? So you want to be able to communicate, but what do you communicate, right? This is where that traffic light protocol can come in, right? Where now you've classified the data and know which entities that you should share that information with and how much. So you got law enforcement, incident reporters, etc. So I talked about that interesting data. Now what can we do with it? Well, now we know the host, maybe the user and device type. Now we've got additional insight. We might know the operating system. We might know whether there's vulnerabilities that were exposed. We've got process, right? So we might know the application behind it, and therefore whether or not it's vulnerable to some type of attack. You've got things like process hollowing, right? These are things that now you've got a better understanding, so we can do something with that information. IP address and geo, this one's easy, right? Because everybody's doing this. Domain, full URI, you've got ports and protocols, you've got application, hopefully, as well as receive and transmit, right? So volume. So that's good. But before we go and finish this off, let's talk a little bit about DNS and how you can use that first domain and expand upon it, right? So when you look at the red domains here, these are domains that could be blocked, right? That maybe the technologies that you're using have some insight into. Maybe not the full campaign, right, depending on the technology, but they could be blocked. The other thing, would it be nice to be able to tie a hash, right, or a malware sample to a website? right, or a domain. That'd be helpful, because maybe the domain looks clean, but they seem to have a lot of threats or malware associated to it. You've got the download URL, right? So that's where they're going to get the malware, and they're going to download it. Co-occurrence, I've already talked about this, right? The value of understanding that, because you're taking that initial understanding and you're expanding on that, right? And maybe now you're starting to peel back the attack infrastructure. So these domains all share the same infrastructure, right? That's that IP address autonomous system number, right? They all seem to be resident in this particular environment. There's that email address. If you get it, that's fantastic. So what can you do? So you've got the infection point. Now we know, right? You've got current malware distribution point. You've exposed the attacker's infrastructure. And now you know the next malware distribution point, right? So some of this might be technology, right? It might be very hard to do with commodity-based stuff, right? They're open source technologies, because there's a lot of cobbling together. But if you're not doing DNS analysis, just imagine the gap that you have. I'm not talking a little function turned on a firewall, because firewalls are great, right? They serve a purpose. But what happens when that endpoint moves off-prem? Remember, we said the perimeter is porous. So that asset is moved off-premise. How good's the firewall that's at the head end, right? I've always said, people say, well, what control should I do when I move off-premise? Like, what should I have on my endpoint? Well, you just spent hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars defending the perimeter because you think there's value. That asset's that same asset, but outside of it, you should have the same controls. The problem is that technology, if anything, you should have even tighter controls maybe, right? Because they're in even though there's really no trusted environment anymore, it is 100% untrusted when they're outside of any wall, right? So now we look at, what do we do with that information, right? So like I said, now we know the operating systems, we know the host itself, so we can do some segmentation and patching. We can blacklist the process, maybe, right? If it's explorer.exe, you might not want to blacklist that, right? It's going to be bad. Patching, you might want to patch the systems. You might want to block the geo, right? Maybe an IP blacklist, some simple things that probably you do today to some degree. URI, right? You can blacklist that domain itself. You can actually build IPS signatures to look for it, right? You could, for applications, now you can blacklist the app, you can patch the app, you can restrict the app. And again, there's all kinds of things that you can do. I'm just giving you an example. And then you might want a rate limit. Now you might say, Jay, that's stupid. Why would I want a rate limit of flow going to a bad Russian site that's taking my data? You're right. You probably don't want to rate, you want to block it, right? But you could use it depending on the scenario. You could maybe rate limit, right? So that's data exfiltration. When you look at SMB probes, you can do microsegmentation. So for example, if you're waiting for everything to go to a control point or L3 boundary, that's not going to stop worm-based type activities or someone moving laterally within the same VLAN, right? So you want some L2 controls, being able to say, you know what, you're on VLAN 1 and you're on VLAN 1. You guys can never communicate to each other. Or you want to be able to push a button to put that control in place dynamically in the event there was an incident. So maybe during normal hours, there's a lot more broader access, but during an incident, you can now move that maybe segment or network or remote office and push them off on their own, do additional forensics on that environment and investigate what might be going on while it's not propagating throughout the rest of your network. Microsegmentation and patching, obviously, if you know host D, you can do the same. Blacklist the app, right? Patching, restrict the app itself. With DNS, you can block the sender. So a lot of people look at a firewall and block. That's fine. But why not take that, maybe that email address and block it in your email gateways to say if you send to us, right? That might be part of a campaign. Or maybe you figured out that you saw someone connect back to us, like to the adversary, and therefore now you're trying to send us email, right? Domains, you might want to blacklist, IPs, etc. Right? So the idea is to take the next step. Right? Passive defenses exist. They're going to continue to exist. And they're going to have some cool buzz terms. And they're going to do some really funky stuff. But you want to take that information that you're learning about a campaign and be able to expand it and actively, truly understand what's happening in the environment at any given point in time. And that's it. Thanks.